As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Leora stepped quietly outside her small home at the edge of the village, the crisp morning air carrying the scent of dew and forest pine. She was used to waking early, but this morning something unusual caught her eye near the forest line. Tiny shapes moved hesitantly among the low grass, and as her eyes adjusted, she realized they were small cubs, no more than a few weeks old, with matted fur and trembling bodies. Their wide, fearful eyes scanned the surroundings, glancing toward the village with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty, unsure if humans were friend or threat. Leora felt a sudden pang of concern in her chest. The cubs looked weak, their ribs visible beneath their thin coats, and their tiny paws struggled through the uneven ground as they tried to find food. The villagers, as usual, remained inside or hurried past, fearful of wild animals and wary of anything they could not control. Leora, however, could not look away. She felt a strange connection, as though the small creatures were silently pleading for understanding, and something in their vulnerability reached deep into her heart. She crouched low behind a small bush, keeping her distance but watching carefully, noticing every shiver, every hesitant sniff of the air, and every glance toward her direction. The cubs moved slowly, their tiny heads dipping to the earth as they searched for anything edible. But the forest floor offered little, and hunger was evident in their quivering bodies and plaintive sounds that seemed almost human in their desperation. Leora's mind raced with questions. Where had they come from? How had they survived until now? Could she do something to help them without frightening them further? She remained perfectly still, speaking softly to herself, so as not to alarm the fragile creatures, and in that quiet observation, a sense of purpose began to form inside her. She realized that these cubs were not dangerous. They were lost, innocent, and in need of help, and that for a moment the world had slowed down just for her to notice them. The villagers' distant murmurs faded into the background as she focused entirely on the small, hungry forms, her heart tightening with empathy. There was no rush, no expectation, only the slow, careful act of watching, of waiting, and of connecting silently with creatures who had nothing but their instinct and their trust to rely on. In that early morning light, Leora made a quiet decision. She would stay and observe, keeping her presence gentle and unobtrusive, hoping to understand the cubs' behavior, their needs, and perhaps to find a way to help them survive. It was the first spark of a bond that neither human nor cub could yet name, a connection born out of quiet attention, empathy, and the recognition of vulnerability that called for care rather than fear. And in that moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath as Leora and the tiny cubs met each other across the fragile distance of trust. The morning sun climbed higher, casting warm light over the forest edge and the small village, but it did little to ease the struggle of the tiny cubs that moved weakly through the underbrush. Leora watched them carefully from a distance, her heart tightening with every desperate motion. The cubs' small paws clawed at empty containers discarded near the village edge, their noses pressed to the ground as they sniffed for anything edible, but hunger gnawed at them relentlessly. Some trembled so much that their tiny bodies rocked as they tried to stand, and low, pitiful sounds escaped their throats, barely audible over the morning breeze. Leora's chest ached, a sharp reminder of the helplessness she had felt during the hardest moments of her own life. She remembered nights spent hungry, lonely, and uncertain, when every choice seemed impossible, and the world felt cold and uncaring. Seeing these innocent creatures struggle stirred something deep within her, a mix of sorrow, empathy, and the urge to act. Yet, she hesitated, knowing that wildlife was unpredictable and that intervening could be dangerous both for her and for the cubs. Her mind wavered between instinct and caution, debating whether to step forward and offer help or let nature take its course. Each time a cub pawed at a scrap of trash or sniffed a barren patch of earth, her resolve grew stronger, the undeniable pull of compassion demanding attention. She saw not monsters or threats, but fragile, living beings, innocent and undeserving of suffering, fighting for survival in a world that offered them no mercy. She noticed how their tiny limbs faltered, how their eyes reflected fear and confusion, and how they huddled together for warmth, finding solace in each other's presence even as hunger burned through their bodies. Leora's empathy intensified as she thought about the fairness of life, the randomness of hardship, and the simple truth that anyone, human or animal, could find themselves in desperate need. She imagined how they must feel, weak, hungry, and uncertain who to trust, and it struck her that trust was a fragile gift, even more precious in creatures so small and defenseless. Minutes turned into hours as she observed, weighing every option, careful not to alarm the cubs while her mind ran through scenarios of feeding, sheltering, and protecting them. The forest seemed quieter around them, as if it too held its breath, and she felt the gravity of the moment settle into her bones. Leora realized that this was no ordinary day. It was a moment where choice mattered, where the decision to act, or not act, would ripple far beyond the small clearing where the cubs trembled. Her heart, heavy with compassion yet mindful of caution, decided that she could not walk away. She had to find a way to help, to bridge the gap between human and wild, to offer life and hope to those who had nothing left. In that quiet morning, watching the cubs struggle for every crumb, Leora understood something profound. Empathy was not passive, and sometimes the smallest acts of attention and care could be the difference between life and death. The morning air was cool and still, as Leora stepped carefully toward the small, trembling cubs, holding a few scraps of food in her hands. She moved slowly, aware that any sudden motion could frighten them and send them running back into the shadows of the forest. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, as she spoke to them gently, reassuringly, even though she knew they might not understand the words. The cubs paused, ears twitching and eyes widening at the sight of her, their tiny bodies tense and alert, unsure whether this human meant harm or help. Hunger tugged at them relentlessly, however, and curiosity mixed with need drew them closer, one hesitant paw at a time. Leora knelt low, lowering the food to the ground while keeping her hands still, giving them the choice to approach at their own pace. She could feel her own heartbeat quicken, a mix of hope and anxiety, as she watched the cubs inch forward, sniffing cautiously, circling the scraps before finally daring to eat. Each movement was slow and deliberate, each small interaction building a fragile thread of trust between human and animal. From the edge of the clearing, a few villagers peeked through the trees, murmuring to each other with skepticism. "Wild animals should stay in the forest," one said quietly, while another shook their head, warning that the cubs could turn aggressive. Leora ignored the whispers, focusing on the delicate moment unfolding before her. She understood that fear often clouded judgment, but she also knew that gentle care could create bonds even where mistrust had dominated. The cubs, sensing her calm presence and the safety in her slow gestures, grew bolder, nibbling more confidently from her hands, occasionally glancing up at her with wide, trusting eyes. Leora smiled quietly, feeling a warmth she had not known in months, a connection that transcended species and spoke to something basic and universal, the need for kindness and compassion. She moved a little closer, still careful not to overwhelm them, and offered a few more scraps, letting them see she meant no harm. Slowly, the murmurs of doubt from the villagers were replaced with quiet awe as they watched the small miracle unfold. Humans and wild creatures meeting in mutual respect and trust. Leora's patience, gentle voice, and steady presence allowed the cubs to understand that they could rely on her, at least for now and in that small clearing. A bridge was built, not with words, but with empathy, care, and quiet courage. The cubs no longer trembled as much. They stayed near her, trusting enough to eat, to breathe, and to begin forming the first threads of a bond that would grow stronger with each act of attention, proving that even the smallest gestures of kindness could begin to change lives, both human and animal. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting gentle light across the forest edge, and the tiny cubs moved closer to Leora, their small bodies trembling with both hunger and caution. She held her hands steady, offering more scraps of food, and watched carefully as the cubs inched forward, sniffing the air and weighing their next move. For a long moment they hesitated, ears twitching and tails flicking nervously, unsure if this human presence was safe. Then, slowly, one brave cub reached forward and took the food gently from her palm, its tiny tongue brushing her fingers as it ate. Leora felt a sudden warmth rush through her chest, a mixture of relief, joy, and awe, realizing that the first thread of trust had been woven between them. Encouraged by the courage of the first, the other cubs followed, licking her hands delicately as they accepted the food, their wide eyes shimmering with what seemed like gratitude. Each movement was tentative but deliberate, and Leora stayed perfectly still, allowing them to understand that she meant no harm. From the edge of the clearing, the villagers watched in quiet astonishment. They had long feared the forest creatures, labeling them wild and dangerous, but now they witnessed something extraordinary, a fragile, silent bond forming between human and animal, built on patience, empathy, and simple acts of care. Leora's heart swelled as she observed the cubs' expressions, some curious, some cautious, yet all beginning to show signs of comfort and recognition. She realized that this moment was more than feeding starving creatures. It was an exchange of trust, a connection that transcended species. The cubs began to approach her more confidently, brushing their small bodies against her legs as they ate, no longer retreating at the slightest movement. Leora whispered soft encouragements, not expecting them to understand words, but knowing that tone and intent mattered. Each lick of her hand, each trusting glance, reinforced the bond forming between them, and she understood that patience and gentle presence could overcome even the deepest instincts of fear. The villagers, still observing, felt a quiet shift within themselves. Their skepticism softened, replaced by awe and a tentative sense of hope. They saw that kindness could bridge divides once thought impossible, and that connection could flourish in unexpected places. In that sunlit clearing, time seemed to slow, every gesture of the cubs and Laura carrying weight beyond the moment, proof that empathy and care could spark trust where none existed. Laura allowed herself to feel a mix of humility and pride, knowing that this fragile trust was both delicate and powerful. It was a small miracle unfolding before everyone's eyes, a human and wild cubs forming a bond not through force or dominance, but through patience, understanding, and the quiet courage to reach out across the gap between fear and compassion. In that moment, it became clear that something profound had begun, a connection that would grow and transform both the cubs and the villagers who witnessed it, showing that trust, once earned, could light even the darkest paths. As the days passed, Leora grew more committed to the tiny cubs that had cautiously accepted her presence and care. She realized that leaving them to wander near the edge of the forest or among the village streets was dangerous. Hunger and wild instincts could lead them into trouble. With careful planning, she began to prepare a small, safe area near her home, using wooden crates, soft blankets, and low barriers to create a little shelter where the cubs could eat and rest without fear of predators or harsh weather. Every morning, she would rise before dawn, bringing scraps of food, fresh water, and a gentle voice that reassured the fragile creatures. She moved slowly, avoiding sudden gestures that might startle them, and spent hours sitting quietly, observing their behavior, learning their rhythms, and noticing the smallest signs of distress or discomfort. Despite her careful efforts, not all villagers approved of her actions. Some frowned, whispering fears about wild animals venturing too close, warning that it was dangerous to let them near human homes. Leora heard their concerns, understanding their caution, but her empathy and sense of responsibility outweighed their doubts. She knew that these cubs were not aggressive, they were vulnerable, hungry, and desperate for guidance, and that survival often required patience and courage rather than fear. Her work became a quiet act of bravery, a demonstration of compassion that spoke louder than words or warnings. She built trust by letting the cubs approach her on their own terms, never forcing them, never rushing them, and giving them the space to feel safe. Each time they nuzzled her hands, rested their heads on her lap, or followed her slowly as she moved about the small clearing, Leora felt a deep sense of connection and responsibility. The cubs began to thrive under her care, growing stronger and more confident while remaining gentle and cautious around humans. Leora also noticed the subtle change in the villagers who observed her. curiosity replaced suspicion, and some even began to help her quietly, bringing scraps or offering advice on creating safer spaces. In her dedication, Leora discovered something profound. Protecting the vulnerable was not only an act of kindness, but a testament to courage, patience, and empathy. It was a reminder that life, whether human or animal, often depended on the gentle efforts of someone willing to care when others turned away. She felt pride, not in recognition, but in knowing that her quiet actions were making a tangible difference, that small gestures of attention and protection could give life a chance to flourish. In that small clearing near her home, the cubs were no longer lost, hungry, or afraid. They were learning to trust, to survive, and to respond to care with affection, all because one human had chosen to stand with them when they had nothing but each other. Leora understood more clearly than ever that compassion was not passive. It was deliberate, courageous, and transformative, capable of changing lives in ways no one could predict. Over the next few days, the cubs' behavior began to change in ways that surprised Leora. Once timid and cautious, they now followed her almost everywhere she went, moving alongside her as she walked through the village paths or along the forest's edge. Their tiny bodies stayed close, keeping pace with her steps, yet they never rushed. Each movement was careful, as if they understood the balance between caution and trust. Leora watched in quiet amazement as small gestures of connection appeared. A cub nuzzled her hand as she bent to pick up a stray leaf. Another gently brushed a paw against her ankle while she paused to tie her shoes. Each gesture, subtle yet deliberate, spoke of growing loyalty and confidence in her presence. She realized that these creatures, once fearful and desperate, were beginning to see her not as a stranger, but as a protector and companion. It was a bond that had formed slowly, built not on force or dominance, but on patience, care, and consistent attention to their needs. The villagers, who had initially kept their distance or whispered warnings, began to notice the change too. Some watched from their windows, astonished that wild animals could demonstrate such trust, loyalty, and even affection for a human. Leora, however, paid little attention to their observations, focusing instead on the quiet language of the cubs, the tilt of a head, the soft rumble of contentment, the tentative brush of a paw. She marveled at how these creatures, so different from humans in appearance and instinct, were capable of forming a connection so deeply emotional and meaningful. Each day she learned more about them, the way they preferred certain paths, the small habits that indicated curiosity or caution, and the way they responded to her voice and movements. This growing familiarity brought a sense of purpose to her days. She was no longer just a human observing wild creatures, but a part of a relationship that required care, respect, and understanding. Leora felt a profound gratitude for the trust the cubs were giving her, understanding that loyalty is rare and precious, even among humans, and even rarer when it crosses species. The simple act of being present, offering food and protection, had created a bond that could not be measured by words alone. The cubs' loyalty encouraged her to continue her efforts with more dedication, to provide them not just safety and food, but a sense of belonging. In turn, she felt her own heart expand with empathy, love, and a quiet joy that came from witnessing life flourish through trust. Each day became a lesson in patience, humility, and connection, showing her that relationships are built over time, nurtured through small actions and understanding. In the gentle rhythm of following and being followed, of observing and responding, Leora realized that the loyalty of the cubs was not just a reflection of her care. It was a reminder of the potential for trust and affection that exists when someone chooses to act with kindness, even in the face of fear, uncertainty, and difference. The bond she shared with the cubs was a living testament to the power of patience, empathy, and the quiet courage to care. As Leora continued her quiet care for the cubs, the villagers, who had at first kept their distance and whispered warnings about wild animals, began to notice the unusual scene unfolding near her home. At first, they watched from behind windows or from a safe distance along the streets, their faces a mixture of skepticism and worry, expecting the cubs to flee or lash out at any moment. But day after day, they saw the same gentle pattern. Leora moving slowly and carefully, the cubs responding with trust, following her, nuzzling her hands, and eating from the small space she had prepared for them. Slowly, doubt in the villagers' minds began to give way to curiosity. They started asking each other questions quietly, wondering how wild animals could demonstrate such clear loyalty and affection toward a human. Some came a little closer, peering over fences or stepping near the edge of the clearing to witness the interactions firsthand. With each observation, amazement replaced skepticism. The cubs, who had once appeared so fragile and desperate, now showed confidence, moving gently around Leora, curling near her feet, and even playfully nudging one another as if accepting her as part of their little world. The villagers could not deny what they were seeing, that a bond had formed, and it was genuine. Gradually, a sense of community began to emerge around the act of care. A few villagers, moved by what they witnessed, started offering help in small ways, leaving scraps of food near the clearing, suggesting ways to improve the shelter, or quietly ensuring that the cubs were not disturbed by stray animals. Conversations that had once been about fear and caution shifted to stories of compassion and the unexpected connections between species. Some villagers even began approaching Leora directly, asking how they could assist, and she welcomed their help, knowing that the cubs' survival would be easier with more hands and caring hearts. The act of looking after these tiny creatures, once a solitary endeavor, had sparked a ripple effect, encouraging humans to pay attention, to empathize, and to act together in nurturing rather than fearing life. Leora watched this transformation quietly, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The cubs, sensing the growing safety and kindness around them, became even more playful and trusting, their energy returning with each passing day. The villagers, in turn, felt a sense of pride and awe, realizing that witnessing and supporting care could change not just the cubs' lives, but their own understanding of empathy and community. In this gentle unfolding, Leora recognized something profound, that acts of kindness, even small ones, could inspire others, bridge fear with trust, and create bonds that extended beyond a single person or a single species. Through her patience and unwavering care, she had not only nurtured the cubs but had sparked a quiet awakening in the hearts of those around her, showing that compassion is contagious and that community often grows from the simplest gestures of understanding and love. The village, once cautious and fearful, began to feel a shared responsibility and pride, a quiet recognition that together, humans could make a difference in the lives of the vulnerable, and that empathy could guide even the most unlikely connections toward trust, loyalty, and hope. As evening approached, dark clouds rolled over the village, heavy with rain and the threat of a sudden storm. Leora noticed the cubs huddled near the edge of their little shelter, their tiny bodies shivering and trembling as the first drops fell. Without hesitation, she grabbed a large blanket and ran through the pouring rain, calling softly to the cubs, encouraging them to follow her. The wind whipped against her face, and the cold soaked her clothes. But she paid little attention to her own discomfort, focused entirely on the vulnerable creatures depending on her. The cubs hesitated at first, startled by the sudden noise and flashes of lightning, but the trust they had built over the past days pulled them forward. Leora guided them carefully, moving slowly yet purposefully, showing them the safest paths and keeping them close against the wind and water. She whispered words of reassurance, her voice cutting through the roar of the storm, and the cubs, sensing her calm presence, followed without resistance. As she led them toward the small shelter she had prepared near her home, the villagers who had been watching from their windows were inspired by her courage. Some ran to help, carrying extra blankets, food, and small containers of water, creating a makeshift safe space for the cubs to wait out the storm. The sight of humans working together to protect creatures they had once feared filled the village with a sense of awe and admiration. The cubs, soaked and trembling, huddled close to Leora, pressing their tiny bodies against her legs and chest, showing complete dependence and trust in the human who had come to their aid. Every movement of hers was gentle and deliberate, ensuring that none of the cubs panicked or strayed into danger. Leora felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief as the last cub was safely inside the shelter, surrounded by the warmth of blankets and the quiet vigilance of the villagers who had joined her. She knelt beside them, brushing wet fur from their faces, and whispered encouragements as the storm raged outside. The cubs' eyes, wide and trusting, reflected gratitude in a way that needed no words. In that moment, Leora realized the depth of the bond they shared. Their survival had become entwined with her courage and care, and their trust was a reward greater than any recognition or praise. The villagers, witnessing this display of bravery and compassion, understood the power of action guided by empathy. They saw that protecting the vulnerable sometimes required risk, sacrifice, and unwavering attention, and that the results could forge connections stronger than fear or uncertainty. By the time the storm subsided, the cubs were safe, dry, and comforted, and the village had been quietly transformed. Leora's courage had not only saved the lives of the tiny creatures, but had inspired those around her to act with kindness and bravery. That evening, as the rain ceased and the clouds parted, the bond between human and cubs grew even stronger, a living testament to trust, compassion, and the remarkable strength that comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The storm had tested courage, patience, and empathy, and in the end, it had revealed the extraordinary power of a single human heart willing to act. Under Leora's careful guidance, the cubs began to change in ways that reflected both their growing confidence and the deep trust they had developed with her. Each day, they played more freely near the clearing she had prepared, their movements lighter, their curiosity bolder, and their small bodies filled with the energy of health and safety. Leora watched them closely, smiling as they tumbled over one another, chased leaves in the wind, or nudged her hands with gentle paws. She noticed subtle signs of affection, nuzzles, soft purr-like sounds, and the way they pressed close to her when they rested, all gestures that spoke of a bond stronger than she could have imagined. It was a quiet and remarkable transformation. Wild creatures, once terrified and hungry, now responded to care with loyalty and trust, proving that even the most cautious hearts could be softened by empathy and patience. The villagers, who had initially kept their distance, could no longer ignore the changes. They came to observe, often standing quietly at the edge of the clearing, watching the cubs interact with Leora. They saw her kindness mirrored in the animals' behavior, the way they followed her without hesitation, accepted her touch without fear, and even seemed to anticipate her movements. Slowly, awe replaced skepticism, and the villagers began to understand that compassion could create connections that defied fear, instinct, and expectation. Leora's daily efforts, feeding, watching, guiding, and gently correcting the cubs, showed that trust was built through consistency and care, not through force or control. She had become not only a guardian, but a friend to the cubs, and the bond they shared was visible in every playful leap, every cautious step toward her, and every tiny gesture of affection. For Leora, the experience was transformative. She realized that patience and empathy could touch lives far beyond her own, and that loyalty and love were not limited to humans alone. Each interaction reinforced the understanding that kindness is an active choice, and when extended to those who are vulnerable or unfamiliar, it could lead to extraordinary results. The cubs flourished not just physically but emotionally, learning to trust without fear, play without hesitation, and respond to care with devotion. The villagers, inspired by what they witnessed, began to apply the lesson in small ways within their own lives, recognizing that courage and compassion could shape relationships and communities alike. The clearing near Leora's home had become a living testament to what could be achieved when a single human acted with selfless care. The once timid cubs were now confident, playful, and loyal, reflecting the nurturing they had received and the trust they had placed in someone willing to see them as more than wild animals. Leora felt a quiet satisfaction and humility, knowing that the bond she had formed was rare and precious, and that it demonstrated a truth both simple and profound. When humans act with compassion, even the wildest hearts can respond with love and loyalty. It was a connection that transcended fear, hunger, and survival instincts, showing that trust, patience, and care could create relationships that endure, inspire, and transform the world around them. Years after the first hesitant steps and tiny nuzzles of the cubs, the story of Leora and the small creatures had grown into something almost legendary within the village. People still spoke of the early days when the cubs were weak, starving, and fearful, and how one human had quietly, patiently, and courageously reached out to them without expecting anything in return. Villagers remembered the long hours she had spent feeding them, guiding them, and creating a safe space where they could grow. And they marveled at how her compassion had transformed not just the cubs, but the entire community. Children who had grown up hearing the story would gather around older villagers, wide-eyed, imagining the tiny furred creatures following Leora through the fields and forest edges, their small paws brushing against her hands, trusting her entirely. The cubs themselves had thrived under her care, becoming playful, healthy, and confident, yet always carrying a gentle loyalty that reminded everyone who saw them of the bond they shared with Leora. More than that, the villagers saw a lesson in her actions, that empathy and courage could reach beyond fear, doubt and instinct, creating connections that were strong enough to last a lifetime. They spoke of the stormy nights she had risked herself to save the cubs, and the small moments when she had simply sat with them, quietly offering comfort and safety. The story became a symbol of what one person's care could accomplish, a tangible reminder that the world could be changed not by force or power, but by patience, understanding, and the willingness to act with kindness. Local children learned to approach animals with respect, patience, and gentleness, inspired by Leora's example, and adults began to see the value of small acts of care in everyday life. Over time, the village itself changed in subtle ways. Neighbors helped each other more, shared resources, and looked out for the vulnerable, human or animal, because they remembered how trust and loyalty had blossomed from a single act of compassion. Leora, now older, would sometimes walk near the clearing where the cubs had once huddled, watching them play and interact, and feel a quiet satisfaction that her efforts had left a permanent mark. The bond she had nurtured between human and cubs became a living lesson, showing that even in the face of fear, hunger, or doubt, connection and care could overcome instinct and uncertainty. The story was retold at gatherings, festivals, and quiet conversations, emphasizing the enduring truth that kindness, when offered without expectation, could inspire trust, loyalty, and hope. People remembered not just the survival of the cubs, but the transformation of hearts, both animal and human, and the way a single courageous act had rippled outward, creating a legacy of empathy. In the village, long after the cubs had grown and Leora had aged, her example remained as a beacon, reminding everyone that life could be changed with courage, care, and patience, and that one person's compassion could leave a lasting positive mark on the world around them. It was a legacy that proved empathy could endure, inspire, and unite, leaving a story that would be remembered for generations.